Hi, I'm Andy Murray. Welcome to It's a Customer's World podcast. Now more than ever, retailers and brands are accelerating their quest to be more customer-centric. But to be truly customer-centric, it requires both a shift in mindset and ways of working, not just in marketing, but in all parts of the organization. In this podcast series, I'll be talking with practitioners, thought leaders, and scholars to hear their thoughts on what it takes to be a leader in today's customer-centric world. Today I have with me Steve Dennis. Steve is a consultant, keynote speaker, and author focused on retail growth and innovation. He has been named a top global retail influencer by multiple organizations, and his thoughts on the future of shopping are regularly shared in his role as a Forbes senior contributor. His new best-selling book is Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Digital Disruption. During my talk with Steve, we discuss his new book and a few of the 8 essentials he outlines as key principles for becoming remarkable. Steve speaks with the wisdom gained from doing the hard yards of being in retail as a senior leader for some of the biggest and best-known brands. I thoroughly enjoyed our talk as we cover not only the history of how we got here, but what the road looks like ahead. I know from what you stated, and I think the early beginnings of that you had this on your bucket list to write a book. So take me to that moment when you said, I'm actually going to do this, and you actually set out on that quest to write it.
Well, I'll try to keep it short because it's a little bit of a long journey. But yeah, as you said, I've wanted to write a book for quite some time. I like writing. I've written, I don't even know, close to 1,000 blog posts and Forbes articles over the last decade. Been doing speaking quite a lot the last few years. So we're definitely working on all sorts of content for a while, but never quite had the right lens on what I thought would carry a whole book. But I think maybe 3 or so years ago, particularly as I was speaking, and having to develop the storyline around what I was going to talk about, a framework and narrative started to develop. And then I just started kind of putting the pieces together. And then, at a certain point, I was like, okay, I'm just going to sit down and really try to outline this as a book. And I went through that process, and that gave me more confidence. And ultimately, I just had to sit down and really pound the thing out. But it really was an accumulation of ideas over a fairly extended period of time. But it was probably about 3 years ago where I really pivoted to saying, okay, I think I've got something that I could turn into a book.
Well, I've got one in process, and I don't think people have any clue if you've never written one, how hard that is and how long it takes. And so congratulations on that. That's quite an achievement.
Thanks. It is, it is a lot of work. The one thing I will say is that even for people that have, maybe you're finding this, even for people that have done a lot of writing in shorter form, I wouldn't say that's always easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly not for me. But yeah, it's just very daunting to try to be able to carry a narrative and a set of ideas over 200, 250, 300 pages. It is really just a different thing, even if you've done a lot of writing.
Yeah.
So.
Well, let's talk about that. Yeah, I do read a lot, and this is the book when I read it, and it came out in 2020. It's the first book I've seen in a long time that really goes into retail with some great principles or essentials. But not only that, I think that what I enjoyed about it is the pragmatism in it. And you read a lot of things from consultants and professional services type people about you just need to do this, you just need to do that. But if you're not actually worked in retail and been in that space, you may not appreciate just how hard some of those steps are. So you're very candid about the difficulty, the dive facing it. So if we want to talk about the book for a second, the first part goes into a great job of providing context, case studies, and some history on how we basically got here. But in the second part, you lay out these 8 essentials that give people quite a bit to chew on. And perhaps we can take a bit of a quick walk around some of the early part, the 6 probably, or the table stakes, as you call them, to highlight some of that and just get your top line high-level thoughts about each of those. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say what I try to do, as you say in part 1, is really set the stage. But the backdrop really for the 8 essentials is this idea of the need to be remarkable. That even being very good is no longer good enough.
Yeah.
And that's really anchored in a lot of experience I had, both in retail executive roles as well as a consultant, of seeing how uh, product choice was expanding, access was expanding, information was becoming ubiquitous, and really was quite easy for, or increasingly easy for customers, particularly with the advent of e-commerce, um, to make it, almost seamless to be able to find substitutes
Right.
for almost any product, or find a pretty good alternative to whatever it is you were selling as a retailer at a cheaper price or more
Hmm.
conveniently. And so a lot of the scarcity that existed in distribution and choice and so forth for many, many years has really been evaporating, again, particularly because of e-commerce. And so to me, that just upped the bar from a competitive standpoint. And then this idea borrowed very liberally from Seth Godin and his Purple Cow idea about really being remarkable in that not only are you offering something unique and distinctive, but something that literally people are willing to talk about. And so as that became kind of an overarching idea for some of my work over the last few years, what I started to think about was, okay, well, what are the elements of being remarkable? What are both the basic foundational pieces, but also the differentiating pieces? And as I've worked previously in industry and as I worked as a consultant, and then I did some studying, I started to see these common themes across most, if not all, retailers. And my general caveat, or I have two caveats about the essentials. One is retail is such a huge field, as
Hmm.
you know. There's a
Yeah.
lot of different types of retailers. So I hesitate to say that all 8 of these will apply powerfully for every single retailer, whatever their situation might be. But I do find that they can be pretty consistently applied. And the other thing is, I very deliberately call them essentials, or you could call them elements, rather than steps, because they
Yeah.
are not, it's not like a recipe. You do one, then you do two, you do three. The mix of them or the order of them might vary depending upon your situation. So that's behind the 8 essentials.
Well, that's helpful. And for those that don't know, you have a great podcast that's just been launched fairly recently. I think your first episode was with Seth Godin, and you guys talked about Remarkable
Yeah.
and how that. So you guys have had a pretty close relationship for some time, actually, in school together. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've known each other. We were in the same graduating class at Tufts University in a year that I won't mention, but quite a long time ago. And we actually started a business together, or found ourselves in business during the beginning of our junior year,
Yeah.
and have been friends ever since. So yeah, it's been a long journey as friends, and
Mm.
occasionally collaborating on some things.
Mm. There's two types of retailers you might look at it perhaps is the big mass large retailers, and those that are a little more agile or niche in growing into how they grow. And so one of the questions that I had from a macro standpoint on remarkable retail is there's probably a bit of a reason why a lot of people find themselves in this muddled middle. And it's probably because of the volume that's there to
Mhm.
chase,
Yeah.
and to become remarkable for the larger guys, for the niche players and those just starting out. They probably almost always enter into the space from a remarkable perspective and then lose it over time as they scale and grow. But
Yeah.
you do find it a bit more challenging on it doesn't make it any less true that you have to be remarkable, but
Right.
there's some empathy for the guys stuck in the big middle and perhaps how they got there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things going on. And I certainly think that it is a kind of classic challenge to go from whatever made you unique, remarkable, whatever you want to
Hmm.
describe in the early days, and then the demands, particularly as a public company, to
Yeah.
scale. And I use this term advisedly, but to sort of dumb down what you're doing. But you can certainly find plenty of specialty retailers, whether that's in the home goods or apparel or what have you, that in order to attract a wider audience had to get into other product categories or
Yeah.
different price points, or what have you, to be able to scale the business beyond its original place. I mean, Starbucks, I think,
Yeah.
is another company that's gone through a couple of iterations where when they were very much about the independent kind of coffee
Yeah.
store ethos. That's not the kind of business that's going to have 10,000 or 20,000 or whatever
Yeah.
locations they had. So in order to chase growth, they had to do some different things and make it a little bit less special. I think it's a classic balancing act, and it is very hard to preserve those things that often got you to one level
Yeah.
at the next level. But I also think people get stuck in the middle just because the world has changed on them. And certainly if you
Yeah.
look at, and I spend a lot of time on this in the book, but if you look at the moderate department store space, and I worked at Sears a million years ago, but Sears was the biggest retailer on the planet at one time, and Sears opening retail stores out of its catalog business and being very intertwined with the growth of the regional shopping mall. I mean, at one point, regional shopping malls were remarkable, and Sears was the remarkable anchor tenant. But in the last 30 or 40 years, a lot has happened in terms of alternative retail formats and the way
Yeah.
consumers spend their time and so forth. So sometimes either because of shifts in culture, shopping preferences, alternative choices, the world moves away from you, and what made you special no longer works anymore.
Yeah, probably you could almost call it remembering remarkable retailer, because I bet in some people's DNA, especially if you've been in a company for a long time, that it felt more remarkable in the past when you were starting out, and it's a bit of a return to that maybe at times. You mentioned Sears. That was one of my first jobs in college, was
Yeah,
working in Columbus at the distribution, this monstrosity of a distribution center. You might have been there
I have been there. Yes.
in Columbus, and so it was quite a great experience. But I don't know where Sears was on the charts in 81, 82, but it's definitely was still a pretty big player.
I think in the early '80s, Sears was. I think through pretty much all the '80s, Sears was still the biggest
Yeah.
retailer. I think it started to flip early '90s, maybe when Walmart
Mm,
blew past them. But yeah, I mean, it's one of the points I make in the book, and particularly I think the current COVID situation is that it's easy to see, particularly this year, but
yeah.
even in the last 10 years, all this massive disruption, and the ascent of Amazon and others, most obviously. But retail's been a pretty dynamic
Mm,
industry. There have been different waves. Certainly
right.
the regional mall era, then the discount mass merchant era, Walmart, Target, et cetera. Then big box specialty, Home Depot,
Hmm.
Lowe's, Best Buy, Circuit City in the day. And, then Kohl's is off the mall department stores. And so, you know, while the pace of change, I think, is absolutely accelerating, and Moore's Law hasn't skipped over retail, it's always been a very dynamic industry. I just think, now things happen more quickly. And obviously, the more that things are digital and less anchored in big brick and mortar, it's got a lot of different dynamics.
Yeah, I was in 1991. I was working for Procter and Gamble, calling on Walmart, and we
Mhm.
had at that time P&G. I think was bigger than Walmart. I mean, who would have thought? But in one of the top to top meetings I had an opportunity to be in, we were talking about some things like pricing on diapers. If it's a little bit, Walmart wanted it cheaper, they could get more traffic, right? Out of stocks and cosmetics. Looking at, and I could think back in 91 of the three or four items that were on the agenda. And I fast forward to meetings I might have been in last year at ASDA in the UK. The variables we're still talking about the same things in a lot of ways, of
Oh, yeah.
inventory flow. I mean, so the variables themselves are pretty consistent in retail. It's not that complicated, but the dynamic of how they're interplay with each other is just really dynamic, and no 2 days
Yeah.
are alike. And is that your experience?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm actually working on something now where I'm talking a little bit about my journey from Sears to Neiman Marcus, which I
Hmm.
sometimes mockingly call going from the outhouse to the penthouse. And and part of the kind of obvious superficial things I noticed right away was obviously the Neiman Marcus customer, much wealthier, price
Yep.
points much higher. My colleagues dressed a lot better than my former colleagues at Sears. So there
Okay.
were some pretty obvious differences. Dollars per square foot spent on
Yeah,
the store
sure.
build out. Superficially, a lot of things were the same. But after a few weeks sitting in operating reviews, staff meetings, or whatever, we're still talking about sell-through rates and gross
Yep.
margin and inventory
Yep.
turnover. And are we taking care of the customer or not?
Right.
Maybe our view of customer, not maybe, but the view of customer service certainly at Neiman's was different than it was at Sears. But the guts of what makes for
Mm,
a great customer experience is, I think pretty common.
yeah.
It just has to be versioned to the particular purchase occasion or customer segment. And, that can be quite different. But I also advise, I'm on several advisory boards of tech companies that serve the retail industry. And when they're talking about how to present their offering to retailers, I said, well, almost regardless of what you're selling, it still comes back to, are you getting me more traffic? Are you
Mm-hmm.
helping me convert the traffic? Are you helping
Mm-hmm.
me convert the traffic at a higher average order value
That's
or
right.
margin? Are you driving repeat? As a retail formula and certain levers that are pretty much ubiquitous, obviously it operates differently on a website than it does in a store. But the mechanics or the underlying kind of engineering of the profit equation, the guts of it are really similar across category and type of
They
retail.
are, and I think that makes it pretty exciting, actually. And it makes every day a bit different because it's where you put the emphasis on the metrics. And one of the shifts I've seen that's been a bit challenging, and I understand how we got there, is looking at store labor productivity and how
Hmm.
you measure store labor. And depending on how much of a microscope you put on that, there's where you see some of the evolution of poor customer service because customer service, if you're doing a case rate type labor
Hmm.
evaluation of how you're looking at store labor, and labor is really now very expensive in the grand scheme of the total model. Where do they go to pick up hours to hit the monthly? Because every measure has this gamification a bit of
Yeah.
what the unintended consequence that it's hard to mitigate. And if a service desk is, you're not measuring those hours in the productivity of the core store, that's where you go to get surplus hours to make up,
Right.
perhaps. Right. And so it's the unintended consequences that we have when some of these metrics, like you said, that they've been there, they're very similar dynamics, but it's how you put the emphasis on which ones that drive certain behaviors that almost always get you an unintended consequence.
Yeah. I feel like it's been complicated. I mean, there's an aspect that's been always somewhat complicated. I think it's been especially complicated the last few years. One, because I think if you're a retailer, and like this goes back for a while,
Yeah.
or goes back a while when I was at Sears, but I've seen this same dynamic kind of played out, whether we're talking about Penny's or Macy's or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But if you're a retailer that's having a hard time driving sales, and the only thing you can control or you feel like you can control is expenses, and that's the way you're going to improve profit. It puts so much pressure on your expense base. And again, if you're having a hard time getting revenue going, then you cut back on store hours, or maybe you cut back on investing in the store, which then tends to have longer term impact of making matters worse. So it's easy, if you're not understanding the interrelationship between expenses and revenue and loyalty and all that other good stuff, to keep tightening the screws, what I call in the book, optimizing to extinction. Just like slowly doing things. And then, I feel like the pilot is coming on the intercom saying, okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin our initial descent. And it's a descent that many retailers don't seem to be able to pull out of. But
Yeah.
I think the other thing, and I
Mm.
think we're absolutely seeing this accelerated by the pandemic, is the changing role of the store, and how stores are this has been true prior to the pandemic, but I think it's just become much more obvious that stores are playing a broader role in kind of the whole ecosystem of the brand, where store associates are not only sometimes helping, depending upon the type of store it is, could be more or less, but store associate might be helping a customer who is then going to transact online at a later date, or they may be
That's right.
running product for curbside pickup or fulfilling an online order. And so I think it's getting more complicated for brands to understand the interrelationship between the digital and physical channel, as well as managing labor in sometimes, very different ways than simply I'm filling the shelves and I'm at the checkout, uh,
Yeah.
offloading boxes on the dock or whatever. I think
Yeah.
the labor equation is getting a little bit more complicated and
And
needs
I
to be
think
more agile.
when we look at this customer centric idea, and I know you touch on several of the essentials, it sounds easy, or it sounds like it should be intuitively easy to execute, but some of the realities of retail get in the way. So, for example, in my experience from grocery and produce, you could absolutely get to 100% fresh in produce, but the waste you would drive from that
Yeah,
would be so expensive, and so you're trying to optimize how fresh do you want to be versus the waste that you're going to generate, and which has cost in it, but it's also not great to throw away that much produce, and so you're always trying to optimize to get the
mhm,
counterbalance of anything you try to push as a lever. There's always a counter lever, it seems, in retail that has a negative consequence if you go too far,
right.
whether it's a classics markdowns.
Yeah,
One of the challenges or way to diagnose, I think, a retailer is to look at the question: who authorizes markdowns? Is it the store can authorize a markdown, or does it have to be through the merchant? And if the store has that power, then they were probably going to move that out pretty quickly. You would know this better than
yeah,
anybody from a department store. But if the merchant has that power, they might want to hold on a little bit longer. And all of a sudden, the
yeah,
store
yeah,
experience gets a little crowded. I mean, just
yeah.
talk about that particular dynamic, because that's a great illustration. And with your background, department stores, how you solve that markdown question and still be customer centric.
Well, I feel like at one level, and maybe this is overly simplistic, it's kind of the epic battle between effectiveness and efficiency,
Hmm.
understanding what problems you're trying to solve for, because there's certainly lots of things you can do from a near-term perspective or a financial metric only perspective that might be shooting you in the foot
That's right.
from customer loyalty and brand differentiation and all those kinds of things. So I think a big couple big things. One is I think it's very important to have very good segmentation so that when you're talking about the customer, you have a more clarity and granularity about what you're talking about, because very few brands have a customer
Yeah,
in a very generic way, right? They have multiple
that's right.
segments that value, well, are of different values to the enterprise, but also
That's right.
value different things in terms of their needs, wants, stories they want to tell about themselves. So I think you have to have some sense of which customers are we talking about, which purchase occasions, to try to get it a little bit more
Well,
focused. But
on that point, you mentioned the book, and I've used it as well. RFM. It's been around a while, but
yeah,
recency, frequency, and monetary, and being able to tie that perhaps to the call center, so that when that person's on the phone, who are you really talking to? And I still think most retailers haven't connected those dots yet.
no, I mean, there's obviously, I mean, certainly technology is
It can
enabling
do it, yeah.
a lot more of the ability to not only do the value modeling, customer lifetime value
Hmm.
assessment, but also to operationalize that at point of sale or in the call center or whatever. But yeah, there aren't that many retailers that are really actively doing it. And, it's also very, very complicated.
Hmm.
I think this is a little bit off your question, but I think one of the things that I've seen be so powerful in the last few years in particular is to um, not only have an actual customer segmentation and understand customer metrics at a deeper level, but to be doing customer journey mapping so you understand where you have the biggest opportunities to fix underlying issues or hopefully do something really remarkable that you can amplify. And that information informs, I think, part of your question, which is, where do you care the most about taking markdowns? What
Hmm.
financial lever you're most trying to pull? Because uh, if you're focused on your most valuable customers and prospects, you might make some different decisions for certain customers than just sort of the broad brush rule of,
Yeah.
oh, we take
Interesting.
this markdown
That's
on
right.
this date just because that's what our system, our markdown optimization system tells us we should do. There should be some, I think, overlay around customer value and in a broader brand kind of true north to inform those decisions ideally. But it gets into a level of complexity that a lot of retailers are not.
And
not
that complexity often carries cost of investment to get to that
absolutely.
complexity.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's easy. I mean, I always joke around that. Uh, it's easy to do everything based upon the averages, right?
Yeah,
But nobody's, or generally speaking, if you do a distribution, nobody actually represents the average, right? The
that's right.
interesting thing, like I'll just pick on Bed Bath and Beyond for a while. Bed Bath and Beyond's promotional strategy for a long time has been the 15% coupon, and pretty much all is that lots of people won't buy anything unless they have the 15% coupon because that for them that's become regular price, and other people will not buy because 15% isn't enough. uh, and since it's applied to every category, you could just say, well, 15% off in some categories is not a particularly good deal if you were to price that on Amazon, let's say.
That's right.
And in other categories, it's excellent. And the way they solve for that is by eliminating a lot of products from the 15% discount, which just causes customers to go, well, this is kind of a con. And so, so they've managed the business from this kind of average markdown strategy and this kind of, you're an idiot if you don't use the coupon.
Yeah,
And all they've done really is not been able to do markdowns in a very precise way,
yeah.
left money on the table for some customers, not create enough of a discount for others, and then just pissed off a bunch of people because they have so many exclusions. But it's a very simple to execute program, right?
Yeah.
It's very simple.
No, I think you make a great
It just
point.
doesn't work.
Yeah, well, a lot of the customer data you look at in retail historically has been there to serve merchandising and help think about category planning and do that. But more recently, turning toward the customer and really understanding the customer segmentations is a bit newer, and getting an RFM model
Yeah.
that can be used, or a sum value model that could be used in business decision making, whether that is markdown optimization. You don't have to go all the way to personalization of customer data to get those benefits back to be a bit
No,
more customer centric.
yeah. My experience with more, I guess, targeted marketing broadly is I mean, it's certainly a nice idea, and conceptually, I buy into the idea of one-to-one marketing. I mean, I talk about that in my book. I was a huge fan of Don Pepper's and Martha Rogers' work 20 years ago. I mean, it sounded fantastic to me. I think they were a little bit ahead of their time in terms of what culturally and what could be done technologically. But certainly, the closer you get to one-on-one with the customer, the better chance you have to serve them well. But I don't think we have to let that be a barrier to doing some things that can make whatever you do more personalized and relevant. It doesn't have to be exactly segment of one.
Exactly.
And A/B testing can accomplish a lot. At Neiman Marcus, we developed some fairly straightforward models that greatly improved relevance, but we're not literally one-to-one. They might have 32 segments, or
Yeah.
Combination of variables in emails or something like that. So I think it's about getting progressively more customer relevant, and with any luck, developing that learning relationship with the customer, so that when you put something out and it isn't getting a good response, that you can learn from that and apply that to your models and make it progressively more relevant. So I think there's lots of fairly simple targeting strategies that you can do that will make the customer feel more seen and appreciated, and at the same time get you a better marketing ROI.
It does take a bit of a leadership mindset shift to create that test and learn culture, or more importantly, protect that culture. You and I both know from how the retail grind at an exec level and throughout it's an intense, full-on experience. When I was doing consulting and a brand level and agency side, I never appreciated what the 6 years at Walmart and Asda has taught me in terms of the retail true atmosphere of what you have to do to
Right.
drive that business. It is a full on intense experience, and so
Yeah.
it takes a bit of a top down leadership mindset to say we're going to protect some test and learn space, headspace. And we're going to invest in that talent, and we're going to make sure that that is always on, almost that
Yeah.
test and learn, whether that's even store prototypes or making sure you've got something new in the pipeline. And my guess is with COVID coming, that those that had good tests already in play, we're accelerating those tests, and we're in a better position than those that weren't testing in some of the areas that they needed to be testing, or caught a lot more flat-footed, a lot more difficult.
For sure. I mean, I know one former client that, and one other company I happen to know that was not a client, where I had visibility to things they had in their pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not exactly sure why they didn't launch them prior to the pandemic, because they were good ideas, I believe, that would have resonated well with the customer. But in any event, because they were developing an innovation pipeline and were doing a lot of testing, and honestly had what they don't call it this, neither one of them, but what I consider an R&D budget,
Yeah.
because that was part of what was built into their system, and they had that pipeline. Yeah, they were able to get things ready, whereas lots of other companies have been scrambling to catch up or doing things kind of, in a very jury-rigged way, which,
Yeah.
in some cases has been
Well,
okay.
that was survival. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, survival, well, fear of imminent death is often quite a good motivator, it turns out. So,
one of the things that I'm seeing through the COVID with retail, especially, is it picks up on your number two essential about being human centered. Perhaps because of how things feel more local now with retail.
yeah,
Even if you're a mass retailer, you kind of know your store manager a bit more maybe than you might have in the past, because of all the localization of what's happening, which seems to be part of human centered. Do you see that as something that's going to stick, of the role of retail in their local communities?
I hope so. I think that, again, there's I think been this dichotomy between kind of the art and the science, or the left and right brain, that's part of a lot of retail. What I try to get to, well, if anything, maybe there's too many ideas in that chapter, but part of what I try to get to in that chapter is this idea that when we think about how to be more remarkable, it's absolutely important to understand the customer better. And part of the argument I make is we need to really understand the customer fundamentally at a more empathy-driven level, not just kind of features and benefits, or at least dial both of those in. But it's also about expanding what we're doing as organizations and brands to the world more broadly. The most obvious one being our associates, or our vendor partners, or agency partners, or what have you. But I think the role that retailers play in local communities and in the world, writ large. So I think the COVID situation for a lot of folks is engendering more empathy. And as much as it's a cliche to see that in lots of cases we are all connected or in this together. And so I'd like to think that will persist. But we also, even before the COVID crisis, certainly had brands that were making their local involvement, or what they're doing for the world and the community, very much part of their brand proposition. So whether that's, say, Nike with their local stores and designing their stores to be more of the neighborhood they're in, both in terms of product, but also service and who they're hiring and how the stores are designed. But, brands like Patagonia, the whole resale circular economy market is speaking to societal issues, climate change, sustainability. So I think those trends have been building for several years. I certainly think, again, even before the pandemic, we're seeing more consumers say that the social agenda, or the impact on the community or the planet, is important to them, and they're selecting brands that reflect that, or there's more pressure on big corporations like Walmart to have sustainability
Yeah.
and other aspects be part of what they do. So I think the momentum is already going in that area. So I doubt that there's any real going back,
Yeah.
and actually with any luck, there's an acceleration.
I don't know where it was in that chapter around human centered, but one of the thoughts that struck me was I think by calling customers customers, that is such a transactional description
Yeah,
of a relationship,
right,
and it didn't really occur to me until recently that what if we called it people? And when you start looking at you're really serving people, you can
right.
get a bit more human centered pretty quickly than thinking about customer. And there's this little wall of transaction when you think about people as customers, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, no, I absolutely agree. That sometimes I feel like that was the hippie section of my book where I was a little bit, peace. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding?
Yeah.
But I do think it's, aside from my own whatever spiritual view of the world or something, but I do think there is something powerful from a branding standpoint, particularly for premium brands, to say, well, look, we're not just selling you a product and
Mhm.
engineering features and benefits for you. We are solving a problem for you, or we're creating a story for you that goes above and beyond simply this product. Because in some cases, I think this is a big part of human-centered design. We're solving a higher level problem. I think in that chapter I talk about what Harvard Business School professor Ted Levitt said was, people don't buy a drill because
Mhm.
they want a drill. They buy a drill because they want a hole. What is that outcome?
Yeah.
Customer jobs to be done, as others have called it. What is that thing we're doing for you? And if some part of what we're doing for you is um, solving a higher order problem, like being a good citizen, or feeling part of a movement, or finding
Mhm.
people in your tribe, like-minded people that like the same products or like the same causes or want to go running or hiking, or you can
Mhm.
imagine all those things. I think that is, I think from a very selfish business standpoint, we are connecting with people in a deeper way. We are building loyalty, and if they really feel passionate about what we're doing, they're going to tell the others, and that's the
Yeah.
most powerful marketing of all. So I think from a very selfish, practical business standpoint, thinking about people more broadly and about their emotional connection to our brand is good. I also just think it happens also to be a better thing for society, but
Yeah. Well,
that's
and if
perhaps a
you're going
different book.
to, for sure. And if you're going to go down that path, back to your point on customer journey mapping, you'll want to make sure that if you do have a problem and you end up in the call center making a call, you're not going through a call tree that puts you on the hold for an hour, telling you you're a very important customer. Uh,
Right.
you have to stay harmonized then with that purpose through even your weakest touch point is going to be judged, and especially in today's social context where it's easy for a customer to talk and share their brand experience on some of those touch points that are just miserable for a lot of people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, not that this was good, but I think if you had a really bad customer experience 15 or 20 years ago, the people that heard about it was your family or your neighbor or the person you played
Hmm.
golf with or went to church with, or, whatever. It could be fairly contained. Now, it can blow up on you very, very easily, particularly if certain people are willing. I mean, I had a very bad
Mm.
experience with a national retailer, and it was like so antithetical to, and it is going to show up. I'm not going to name them, but it is going to
Yeah.
show up in a future piece of writing of mine. But the experience was just so egregious and almost so comical
Yeah.
that I almost felt like I just had to talk about it on social media, and I just showed uncharacteristic restraint.
Yeah.
But I easily could have, and certainly there are people
Mm.
with way bigger followings that
Mm.
get very vocal about bad customer experience. So it's just, aside from, you should take care of the customer
Yeah.
and live true to your brand promise, things can go really south for you quite quickly. So just
And that's
smart
so,
business
and I
moves.
think that's what's different versus 5, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
How quickly it ends up being a letter to the CEO,
Mhm.
and surprisingly, how many people would be surprised to think how many letters a CEO of a retailer gets.
Oh yeah, right.
it's a lot on a
Yes.
daily basis, and so that does have a big impact. So that's kind of human centered. Other things that might other essentials that you have that I think link back to customer centric would be essential number 5, being personal.
Right.
Is that really about one to one, or is that a different concept than actually one to one marketing?
Well, there's a few things. The core of it, I think, is really a customer insight or being customer led in your strategy, which is to really push to deeper and
Mm,
deeper levels of understanding and then acting on those insights. So that could come from exhaustive customer journey mapping,
mm,
um, or other forms of research to really understand how to be intensely customer relevant. I do talk a little bit about getting closer to one. So some of that is more from an analytic standpoint of, campaign management and a lot of the things that a lot of marketing technology companies have been pushing for years. There's also the aspect of curation,
hmm.
being able to go out and, say, in a more common or historically traditional customer service, personal shopping thing of like, well, if I understand you as an individual personal shopper or as Netflix, I can, go out and find things for you and
Mm,
curate them. So what I'm showing you is much more likely to be to your liking.
got it.
Stitch Fix, there's
Yep.
services that aren't literally one to one, but try to understand you as an individual and bring stuff to you in an edited or curated fashion. And then there's also the aspect of purely custom products. So it's becoming a lot easier um, through technology to either literally make something for you on a one-to-one basis or have enough permutations and combinations like some of the custom sneakers guys
Hmm.
and so forth that it's not technically one-to-one, but there's enough variety that it feels built for you.
Mm,
So I think the underlying idea or what the outcome we want is the customer to feel like, okay, you really get me, you know me, you understand me, you value me. So therefore, my experience with you, whether that's email or shopping in your store or going to your website or signing up for a subscription, feels very personal and relevant. Because the more intensely customer relevant we become, the more we enroll people in our brand. So that can play out in a pretty wide spectrum.
yeah. If you want to talk about the methods of how you get that understanding, and clearly on
Mhm.
an online pure play, you've got different tools there to get that understanding of what customers may or may not want. But when you get into physical stores, I
Yeah.
still think there's a place for behavioral, like observational research of like a
Oh,
Paco
sure.
Wonderhill might take that you just cannot, you're not going to see it in the data side. You just have to be in that store and see it. Is that still your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fantastic is that, and I think in reality, as much as it gets marketed pretty heavily, there aren't a lot of companies that are really applying AI, machine learning.
No.
May, maybe in their investor deck, but when you actually look at what's being applied, it's still pretty limited. But there's certainly lots of technology that is evolving pretty quickly that allow you to make inferences from various observations. And I think that's more outbound marketing or in support of things. But
Hmm.
absolutely, there's lots of I guess ethnographic research or whatever you
Hmm.
would call it that can inform your overall strategies. And so, uh, and there's some pretty cool advances there of cameras being put in stores and
Right.
tracking heat indexes and things like that. Some of which has been around for a while, but is being taken to the next level. I have never found, and I've been involved
Mm,
with customer insight and retail for 30 years or so, and tried a lot of different techniques. I think there's generally speaking no one approach that's going to get you to where you need to get to. I think even some of the companies like Stitch Fix that are
mhm.
very, very dependent on data science are having an overlay of human beings and conversation. I think some of that actually helps their prediction. Some of that is being responsive to consumers want to talk to another human being sometimes, whether whether the robot could do a technically better job or not. There's a need for connection and feeling heard. And so I think we have to look at all the techniques that are out there and find the ones that work best for us. Things are constantly changing. So it's worth staying on top. But
one of the best things I had an opportunity.
Understanding the customer that's going to get us
Yeah.
The input we need to be more relevant and remarkable.
Some simple things you could do is just go sit at a call center on the phone for a day, and it's just surprising what you hear and the challenges they have, and it creates a lot of empathy for the customer challenges they get. And so the call center, reading customer letters, go out in stores, it is a portfolio, a smorgasbord of tools you have to put together to really get your dialed in on the customer, I think.
Yeah, I think I feel like, merchandising, store operations, customer insight, they're all a mix of art and science. Certain situations will lead you more to the science side or the art side, but I think you need both. And there are some obvious limitations to even the most advanced, sexy technologies that won't get you there. Yeah, I mean, I had a job a bunch of years ago where I had call center reporting to me, and I used to listen to calls all the time. And it was probably the most amazing research. And, even when I would listen to calls, and then sometimes I would take calls. When I would take calls, it gave me an opportunity to actually get into a dialogue. And even though it was a relatively small sample size, it just added to understanding in a way that our pretty large sample quantitative surveys just didn't. So I don't think there aren't too many business where you can kind of sit in the command center and just stare at the screen of things and read reports. Particularly certain kinds of retail, which are just fundamentally more emotional, tactile, things that are just harder to capture in bits and bytes.
What people may not understand about retail is just how diverse the skill sets required to do it well, if you talk about a total retail, can be. And I found it to be one of the most exciting career spaces to be in. If we shift gears just a little bit and talk about the talent pipeline, and specifically perhaps what's coming out of universities today, a career in retail, if you're a student, a freshman or sophomore, may have some misbeliefs about what it really is. And there's a large part that feels like it's folding sweaters in a department store. But actually, if you look at all the areas of logistics and the things you could get into from a retail career, what would be your pitch to a college student that might be trying to understand, should I get into retail or not? Hopefully it's don't. Hopefully it's not don't get into retail.
Well, first of all, I mean, it's really amazing. I mean, I think it's been true for a long time that there is a really wide range of skills and talents that are needed across different retailers. And if anything, I think it's gotten even more diverse because there's this whole kind of engineering, advanced technology skill set that's becoming more prominent. But I think the first question is, do they see them? And I hate to be too black and white about this, but are they more attracted to kind of the left brain or the right brain side of retail? Because I still think there is plenty of art-driven or artist-driven creative pieces of retail, whether that's visual merchandising, site design, aspects of certain kinds of merchandising, fashion merchandising, certainly. So there's maybe a little bit of a fork in the road, but if they're more like, I'm not sure, or balanced, one of the most interesting things I've seen develop over the last few years, and I was fortunate to set this up when I was at Neiman Marcus, was really the kind of the bridge between the traditional merchandising or store operations side and the more analytics side. And they're called a lot of different things, but business analysts or strategy analysts that are doing really interesting problem solving, but they're sitting in many cases between the technology or the PhD statisticians or data scientists and the people more on the front lines. in different roles, and trying to figure out how to bring those two sides together and problem solve. And I think that often takes somebody, whether they're an undergraduate or MBA or master's or what have you, but it takes a more generalist business skill set, maybe some of the disciplines you learn academically on a more technical side, and applies them in a really, really powerful way. So I think, companies are at different stages of bringing that sort of talent in, and whether it resides in strategy or marketing or what have you might be different by company. But I think in many cases you're really bringing in a very interesting mix of skills. It's kind of the leading edge of where applied business is in the retail setting, and I think there's a tremendous demand. So I'd like to think that there's upside in terms of
Yeah.
career progression and growth.
Well, if you are interested in data science, it's hard to find an industry that creates so much data to analyze than a retail environment. I mean, you could quickly accumulate millions and millions of data fields on a daily basis but the challenge has been taking that data and applying it to a real business challenge and a case study or user story that you're really trying to connect the dots on. So I think it's a rich field with a great base of data to start working on big data. And like you said, I think it's still early days for us to get the full power of that data science capability applied to real business challenges that create value creation for the business. Those are still, in most cases, it's still in front of us instead of with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I've seen various studies Forrester and others have done about where companies are on kind of this digital or data insight maturity. Yeah. And I don't think, and I haven't independently validated those studies, but I trust Forrester, these companies. And I think, they show 70-80% of companies are still relatively immature and really applying data science in a super impactful and meaningful way.
Well, I have the privilege of working with the Walton College of Business, and the always proactive Professor Molly Rapert in the marketing department heard you and I were going to speak today. So she gathered a few questions from her students. Do you mind taking a few of those questions?
Be happy to.
Excellent. The first is from Trevor Mayhew, and he is a marketing major.
Mr. Dennis, I watched your video titled Omnichannel is Dead and the Future is Harmonized Retail. I was wondering if you could talk about some examples of retailers that are really achieving harmonized retail successfully during this time of COVID.
Sure. So, well, first, the reason I like harmonized over omnichannel is really this idea of all aspects of the customer journey really singing beautifully together. And I think there are quite a few companies that are doing well at this. The easiest ones to point to are a lot of the digitally native vertical brands, so the Warby Parkers or Untuckits, but these companies that started online and then moved into retail. And I think they had two important advantages, at least. One was because they were rooted in a digital experience, they just translated it to that physical store, and they never created this kind of siloed thinking. I think they just got that the customer was the channel. It needed to be all one shopping experience, and customers are going to sometimes transact in a store and some transact online and sometimes get served in the store with a product. And so they just saw it as one thing. And then the second advantage they had is they weren't burdened by a lot of legacy systems or legacy thinking. So they got to design it in a harmonized way as they grew and deployed it. So lots of those sort of retailers, I think, do it very well. But I think companies like Walmart and Best Buy and Nordstrom are getting pretty darn good at this. I think they have largely broken down the silos. I think they have seen that the integration between digital and physical is important, and have put a lot of the steps in place. So, and I think if you point to some of the success, not just during the pandemic because they sell essentials, but some of the success prior to the pandemic among those companies, a lot I think can be attributed to their enhancing their e-commerce capabilities, but I think more importantly, seeing their stores as assets when they are well integrated.
You picked a great word with harmonized. I think that word applies also to harmonizing merchandising and store operations.
Yeah.
It's not an or, and it's easy to get caught on pendulums of it's all about digital, all about physical. But harmonized is a great word that probably is more important to retailers than anybody else because of the competing things that you have to balance all the time.
Yeah, and not to get too hung up on the semantics, but I also felt like a lot of the lexicon that had been developed, if you want to be literal about it, omni-channel is, all channels and
Yeah,
or everywhere, right? And I don't think it's so important to be everywhere. I think it's important to show up powerfully in the ways that matter to the
right.
customer in that moment, or seamless. But I don't know many customers who say, oh, I'd really love Sears if they didn't have so many seams. It's not to me, it's not a
I love it.
customer friendly
No, right,
word. Not that
right.
harmonized is normally used in retail, but I mean, I think it at least is more evocative
Yeah,
and speaks to a positive
right.
as opposed to eliminating a negative and kind of an inside baseball way of talking about
Yeah,
a customer.
exactly, exactly. Our next question comes from Bailey Stetmeyer. She is a marketing major.
Mr. Dennis, I enjoyed listening to your video, Making Retail Memorable. And if you look at the retailers that are really doing an effective job in making retail memorable, what are 3 common characteristics that you think account for their success?
Sure. Well, that's a great question, Bailey. Maybe not so easy to boil down, but I think generally when it comes to being memorable, first of all, it has to be very unique and distinctive. Something. So I draw heavily on Seth Godin's work in Purple Cow. So if you think of most cows being brown, the purple cow is the one that really stands out. So I think minimally it needs to stand out in a powerful way. The second thing, though, is you can stand out and not be useful or relevant. So so what is it that you are doing in a powerful way for me that really solves a problem or connects with me? And then I think the third, and this is the hardest thing to do, is not only are you unique, not only do you solve a problem for me, but do you give me a powerful story to share? Because I think the brands, and again, drawing on some of Seth's work, the ideas that spread are the ideas that win. So how is what you're doing for me give me more than just a product, more than just something I'm going to keep to myself, but something I'm going to say to my friends or on Instagram, this is amazing. I can't believe how fantastic this product is, or how good this service is, or how they treated me, whatever, but something that literally causes them to remark upon. Because that's what I mean by remarkable, is not just that it's different and distinct, but literally people will spread the story of your brand.
That's
Easier
good.
said than done.
It's a story where it's a shopping experience worth sharing.
Right.
And boy, I tell you, that also stacks up against what I've seen in terms of the best ROI on your media spend is that shared, earned media that gets shared. So it's got a lot of truth to it all the way through the line.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's an older idea. I think what I try to do in the book is to just really, say that it's so hard today with so much competition and so much noise to be that signal amidst the noise. And part of that is, yes, having something different, having something that solves a real problem. But what gets amplified is, that's the thing that breaks through and carries forward. And yes, is amazing ROI if you can make it happen.
Excellent. Last question, a bonus question from Jonah Rapert. He is a Walton Honors senior and a major in marketing. He's actually a double minor in economics and legal studies. So here's Jonah.
Jonah sounds like a busy guy.
Mr. Dennis, in your book, Remarkable Retail, I found it interesting to see the chart of the top 10 retailers by decade, and to learn that Doug McMillan keeps a copy of this with him on his phone to remind him how quickly retailer fortunes can change. Given all that has happened with COVID this year, what retailers would you expect to see at the top of this list at the end of 2020, noting that Walmart, Kroger, and Amazon topped the 2017 list?
Well, I haven't looked. That's a great question. I haven't, and it's actually something I need to update. I haven't looked at where some of these retailers stand this year, but certainly Amazon, Walmart, and Kroger will be near the top. Some of that is just their sheer size. Some of that has been, for better or worse, one of the things that COVID has done has tilted the fortunes towards those brands that are selling essential merchandise. So, and it's also given, and I hesitate to use this word, a gift to certain very strong digital retailers like Wayfair, for example. I don't think they'll make the top 10, but they have had some huge growth because of stores being shut down, and just the kind of tendency to be digital first in a lot of products. So I don't know how dramatically actually the 2020 list will change from 2017. I think it's a little bit of the rich getting richer and the winners and losers in this kind of bifurcation effect. But yeah, I mean, Home Depot, Lowe's, Best Buy, the big supermarkets, Walmart, Target, Amazon have all done disproportionately well during the pandemic, but they were already on a good trajectory, and certainly outside of Amazon, the brick and mortar guys have really improved their digital capabilities, which has served them well also during this time.
Great perspective. Well, this has been fantastic, Steve. Any last sharing thoughts, either to students or to faculty that are working diligently in this space? What gives you hope about, even though I could be quite cynical, I imagine you could be as well, but as you look out to the future, what gives you hope?
I think the main thing that gives me hope, and in fact, I was just working on some writing on this, is I think clearly the pandemic has had some very awful effects, most obviously on people's health and economic well-being. And so it is hard sometimes to be hopeful when we've seen so much trouble and destruction. But I think one of the things we've learned from other crises is that when there is a lot of change, there is also a lot of opportunity and innovation that's created. So I think some of the more agile, innovative companies are being stretched to try things because business as usual is not working for them and probably won't work going forward, even if we have a good recovery. But I think the other thing, and I saw an article the other day about how the rate of business formation has really spiked in the last few months. And I think it seems like these times bring out entrepreneurs. Now, maybe that's because they lost their job and they're scrambling to find something new to do. Yeah. Maybe because rents have dropped in some physical space, it suddenly makes their idea workable because the rent is half the price. Or maybe a company that has gone out of business, but there's still a market opportunity if they're well capitalized. So I just think there's lots of innovation that happens in this period of time. And, that will create new and different businesses next year and beyond that will be pretty exciting. And I think it's exciting if you're a student or just an entrepreneur, or maybe somebody who's been working for a big company that wants to do something new. And this is the thing that gives you the push, even if it looks pretty tough right now.
Great word. I found retail to be a very exciting space that it seems like you could get your idea into action pretty quickly and see results almost instantly. So it's one of the fun places to work, and even though at times it can be quite challenging. Steve, thank you so much. I'll be sharing more in the notes around how to access your book, make sure people have a chance to get connected to your podcast. It's you've got some great guests in there and some great insights. And so, and again, congratulations on getting that launched and being a thought leader in this industry that desperately needs people to provide that direction. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening in to a powerful conversation with Steve Dennis. My takeaway is that no matter how difficult the dive is, there is no escaping the elephant in the room that retailers can't really thrive in the long run by optimizing and cost-cutting, especially if the proposition isn't remarkable. Time has proven that to be true over and over. The answers for becoming remarkable can always be found not by copying competition, but by listening to the customer. That's it for this episode of It's a Customer's World. If you found this helpful and entertaining, I would be so grateful if you could share our show with your friends. And I'd be super happy if you subscribe so you can be updated as we publish new episodes. And if you really want to help, leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. It's a Customers World podcast as a product of the University of Arkansas Customer-Centric Leadership Initiative and a Walton College original production.